Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Making Markets Multitask, Mexico Medical Device Market Access and ISO 1345 certification for the rest of the world. My name is Sarah Steck, and I'm the Legal and Regulatory Director here at GMed North America. One of the largest growing medical device markets in the world is the Latin American market, and the largest of those markets is the Mexican medical device market. The Mexican medical device registration process is different from that of Europe and the US, although there are some common elements, such that the manufacturers who are approved for sale in the US or the EU may be able to make their product submissions multitask a little bit. Likewise, manufacturers located in Mexico would also see some common elements between their specific processes and those of the EU. For this webinar, I'll be joined by a special guest, Miguel Angel Torres-Tello of Emergo Group Mexico, who will lend us his extensive expertise in the area. Now, at the end of the presentation, both Miguel and I will stick around for about 10 minutes or so to answer questions for you today. So you should use the question and answer boxes and the chat boxes that will stay up throughout the presentations to submit your questions. After the webinar, we'll answer any questions that we didn't get to and send the answers to you in a couple weeks. Or, if you can't wait that long, you're more than welcome to send us an email at the email address that you'll see on the last slide, or give us a call. And as many of you know, we like to pick up the phone and we're pretty responsive over email, so you're sure to get a response. Also, if you have any technical issues, please let us know by typing it into the chat box and we'll try and solve them in the webinar. So now let's get started. Like I mentioned, I'll be joined today by Miguel Angel Torres-Tello. He's the Business Development Manager for Emergo Group Mexico. As part of his activities, Miguel is constantly participating with local chambers of commerce, associations, and COFEPRIS, the Mexican Ministry of Health, for better regulatory affairs practices. This, along with his 5 years of experience in RAQA for medical devices in Mexico, has allowed him to understand, apply, and suggest changes on the local regulation for medical devices. Miguel has participated with the Mexican Pharmacopoeia to update the medical device supplement, supported Kenny Pharma on new updates for deregulated medical devices, and presented RA webinars for different chambers of commerce in Mexico. Miguel, we are very happy that you could join us. So now that you know who you're talking to, let's see what we're talking about today. First, we'll go over some basic information about the Mexican medical device registration process and how ISO 1345 fits in. Then we'll get into leveraging market access for Mexico and the rest of the world. And finally, we'll talk about using the elements from the Mexican and the rest of the world's registration processes and product submissions. And with that, let's get started with some basic information. Miguel, could you please go ahead?
Well, thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for attending this webinar today. As Sarah mentioned, we will give a brief overview about the regulatory affairs process you have to follow here in Mexico to receive your sanitary registration for medical devices. The first thing I would like to speak about is regarding the classification system we have in Mexico. As in other countries, there are different classes based on the level of risk to the patient of the medical device. We have 4 different classifications. As you see in the slide, we have class 1 low risk, 1, 2, and 3. In the following slides, we're going to talk about the regulatory affairs routes you will have to submit your paperwork and receive your sanitary registration in Mexico. These are only applicable for class 1, 2, and 3 medical devices. For class 1 low-risk devices, the process in Mexico is fairly simple. It only requires a few documents from COFEPRIS, which we might say are a letter that gives authority to your importer or distributor to commercialize your product in Mexico, and instructions for use or manuals of the product. Basically, that's the only information you will require. It is not the case for Class 1, 2, and 3 devices, for which the paperwork and the time frame to receive your approval is more in the case of paperwork, and more time to wait for receiving your sanitary registration. Now, as we said, we have different regulatory routes to submit your paperwork in COFEPRIS, which is the Ministry of Health in Mexico. These different routes are only applicable for Class 1, 2, and 3 devices, not for Class 1 low-risk device. Now, we have the standard registration process and the equivalency agreement, where we're going to further talk about that. For the standard registration process, this is all applicable for products that are manufactured in Mexico or manufactured outside Mexico and are approved in the country of origin. This is important. For instance, if your product is manufactured in Europe, but you don't have CE mark, but for some reason you have FDA approval, then you're not eligible for the standard registration process. Then we have the third-party reviewers as the second possibility. The paperwork you have to submit for this route is the same as for the standard process route. Basically, the third-party reviewers option is for those that want to speed up the revision process in Mexico. Third-party reviewers are private entities approved by COFEPRIS to present a pre-approval that will expedite the revision process in COFEPRIS. This obviously implicates higher prices that must be paid to the third-party reviewer that I'm showing in the table in this slide. Regarding timeframes, it's good to do to compare timeframes with the standard process and the third-party reviewer process. As we said, the paperwork is the same, but if you basically submit directly your paperwork to COFEPRIS through the standard process, it will take from 6 months to 1.5 years. Mainly, this is independent on the classification. Probably for Class 1 product, this might be 6 months to 1 year. But for Class 2 and 3, this will take 6 months to 1.5 years. If you use a third-party reviewer, independent of the classification, you will receive your approval in 3 to 4 months. The time frame for Class 1 low-risk devices is 2 to 3 months to receive your approval. This is much faster. Now, the process, the way it works with the third-party reviewer is basically you have to present your paperwork to the third-party reviewer. They will review all your documents in 2 weeks to 4 weeks. They will, if they have any comment or question, or if they consider you need it is more information is required, they will request it directly to you. And after that, you will receive a pre-approval, which basically is stating that the third-party reviewer approved your paperwork. You will go with your documentation, with your technical information, legal documents, with your dossier, and with your pre-approval from the third-party reviewer to COFEPRIS, and this will implicate that someone else, the third-party reviewer, has reviewed your information, and this will cause an expedited revision from COFEPRIS, the 3 to 4 months. We also have the option for equivalency agreement. These agreements were approved in 2010 and became effective in January 2011 for the case of products that has been approved in Health Canada and US FDA. And the same happened for the product that has been approved by the Ministry of Health in Japan in 2012. This agreement was part of an alternative or solution from the authorities to push through backlog submission and expedite the registration process. At the beginning, the results regarding timeframes were positive. We were receiving submission approvals after 3 to 4 months. But unfortunately, nowadays it takes 6 to 12 months if we go through using the equivalence agreement for products that has been approved for Health Canada or US FDA. It is not the case for Japan. It might take less from the 6 months, and we consider this is happening because not many manufacturers are using this option. Now that we have been talked about the classification system in Mexico, about the regulatory routes in Mexico, we are going to further talk about how we classify the products in Mexico. We said in previous slides that we have class 1, 2, and 3 devices, and also the class 1 low-risk devices. For class 1 and 2 and 3 medical devices, in Mexico, the classification criteria is semi-equivalent to the European Union medical device directives. There are slight differences. We have 18 rules plus 2 additional rules that are for certain IVD products and hygiene products. We also have an official list of 96 class 1 low-risk devices. There cannot be more than 96 class 1 low-risk devices based on this list. So just be sure that your product, if you consider that it's a class 1 low-risk device, just be sure that it is included in this list. In the same list, you will find all the regulated medical devices. They're only mentioned in general terms, like hospital beds, for example. And this document is really useful for those manufacturers that consider their products are not medical devices, and for some reason their custom brokers doesn't feel comfortable with that decision. You can present this document, which, by the way, was released in December 31st, 2011. Today, in our case, we are working with chambers in Mexico on a new list for the regulated medical devices, which probably will include tariff codes as well, which is useful for those who has to export your products to Mexico, since the tariff code is a code that is commonly used by custom brokers, and this in customs will allow you to export easily your products, or at least to identify if your product is a medical device or not. For those that has experience in Europe, there are differences between IVDs and medical devices. There are different directives for them, for that type of products. It is not the case for Mexico. In Mexico, we have a general definition for medical devices, which includes IVDs. Now, you already know if your product is a medical device or not, and the classification based on the guidance and the official list we have. But it is also important to consider how to group your products. For instance, if you have a wound dressing with different sizes, same commercial name from the same manufacturer, then you can group all your different sizes in the same registration. But if some of these variables changes, then, for example, if you have the same wound dressing, brand X, 10 different sizes, 4 of these sizes are manufactured by manufacturer X, and the 6 remaining sizes are manufactured by manufacturer Y. Then you have different sizes manufactured by different manufacturers, and the conclusion here is that probably you will have to have one registration for 4 different sizes and another registration for those other 6 sizes. So just in summary, if you want to group your products in the same registration, you will have to consider that those are manufactured by the same facility, the same place, of course, and with the same brand, and that the material, formulation, and intended use is equal. If you're complying with, if all your products are complying with these points, we can be almost sure that your products can be grouped in the same registration. Of course, this is important to be considered because otherwise, if you do not take a good decision here, you might end up with more than one registration, and this might affect your budget. These are some examples of different medical devices for class 1 low risk. We have cotton resins, gauzes, band-aids, optical and surgical microscopes, motion exercises, color splints, and others. As we said, all of them are clearly described or mentioned in this list of 96 class 1 low risk devices. In the case of dressings, be careful. The authority is only considering simple dressings, wound dressings. If those include substances like silver hydrocolloids, hydrogel, those will be considered class 1 or 2 devices based on the rules. We also have examples of the regulated products: hospital beds, standalone software, stretchers, walkers, and scales. In the case of standalone software, we have to be careful. It is not regulated in Mexico as it is in other countries, but we strongly suggest to mention it in your products. For example, for medical equipment on which medical software is used, you can mention your software. Not all the custom brokers feel comfortable, receiving or importing software like CDs or equivalent. Now, we know the classification, the grouping, which regulatory routes we have. Now we are ready to submit our paperwork to receive our center registration. It is important to consider the Mexico registration holder, or in other words, the legal representative you will have in Mexico. This legal representative will be the point of contact for the Minister of Health in Mexico for any question they might have. They are also giving them the legal authority to do any amendment to your registration. It is important to think about the holder because that is the only entity allowed to do anything to your documents. As a manufacturer, you cannot, you are not representative for COFEPRIS in this case. So most of the times, the importers or distributors are the holders of your products, and they will be responsible for all the activities related for the holder. Some of these responsibilities is to have a medical device warehouse in Mexico and be in compliance with the technovigilance program based on the Mexican norm 240 and the good documentation practices based on the Mexican norm 241. So just be sure that once you select a holder in Mexico, ask them if they are in compliance with these two norms. Otherwise, COFEPRIS might do an audit to the warehouse of the holder, and if they are not in compliance, they might create some troubles in the commercializations of your medical device. Now, I just want to give a brief overview of all the documents you will require to submit an application. This is just a general overview. Of course, there are more specific details about them. And in the case of this webinar, it is not the purpose to talk about the technical information, but about a specific document that is always required for class 1, 2, and 3 devices, the good manufacturing practices. This is a document that in general is required by that is all the time required by COFEPRIS.
Thanks, Miguel, for all that really good information. Now, one common element that Miguel talked about is the requirement for good manufacturing certificates. Good manufacturing practices are generally created by the manufacturer's quality system. ISO 1345, the standard for quality management systems for medical device manufacturers, specifies requirements for a quality management system for an organization that has to implement the design, manufacture, and putting on the market of medical devices. Now, ISO 1345 helps medical device manufacturers meet both customer and regulatory requirements. And in fact, if you read the introduction to ISO 1345, it calls out to manufacturers specifically to take into account those regulatory requirements. ISO 1345 is applicable not only to medical device manufacturers, but also suppliers of products and services to medical device manufacturers, including distributors. For example, for sterilizers, a lot of times they also have ISO 1345 certificates for sterilization services. Now, ISO 1345 is a voluntary standard for the EU, but it may be required by other medical device regulatory authorities. Now on this slide, you'll see the main topics that are covered in ISO 1345, and you can read them just as well as I can, so I won't read them to you, but you should definitely take a look at them. They correspond to the major topics in ISO 1345. And even though these are the broad strokes, you should take a look at each main topic in order to see the subtopics included in those main topics. So, for example, you notice that design specifically isn't on this list. Where it is under product realization. Product realization is where you find sort of all your necessary clauses for design. So now that we have some of the basics, let's quickly talk about how, if you're not already in Mexico and you have ISO 1345, how you can get to Mexico. Miguel, can you please lend us some of your expertise here?
So we said earlier that good manufacturing practices are required by COFEPRIS, one of the legal documents, all the times for class 1, 2, and 3 devices. So ISO 13485 for all cases is always accepted as good manufacturing practice certificate. In legal terms, it is also accepted the good manufacturing practices that are released by the Ministry of Health or competent authority of the country of origin of the product. If it is not the case, ISO 13485 is always accepted. Based on our experience in Emergo, all our manufacturers has sent us the ISO 13485. This is a very well-known document in COFEPRIS, and this will be accepted without any problem. Just a side note, for those that has experience with CE Mark and Health Canada submissions or FDA approved medical devices, the technical documents you have to submit are similar to the technical files for CE Mark or Health Canada or 510K reports you have presented to the FDA. So if you have approval in some of these countries, US, Europe, or Canada, you basically covers 70–80% of all the documents you will need for receive your approval in Mexico.
Okay, great, Miguel, thanks. Now let's go the other way around. If you have ISO 1345 and you're in Mexico, is ISO 1345 enough for the Mexican GMP requirements? Miguel?
If you have ISO 13485 and you're already in Mexico, and you want to get a sanitary registration, you must be certified based on the Mexican norm 241, which is for good manufacturing practice. COFEPRIS is the entity who will certify you for the norm 241. So, for example, if you only have one facility in Mexico, if you are a Mexican manufacturer, no more facilities around the globe, you have to certify your company. You can do it for ISO 13485, but if you want to get a sanitary registration in Mexico, at least, you will need to be certifying norm 241. There is other scenarios. For example, for US manufacturers, it is common they have contract manufacturers in Mexico, for example. If that is the case, the legal manufacturer will be the US company, and the contract manufacturer will be a Mexican company. If you want to register in Mexico, you will have to mention the contract manufacturer. In such scenarios, you will have to present the NOM 241 certification of your Mexican company. It won't be necessary for the legal manufacturer. So if you are working with contract manufacturers and you're outside Mexico, you will want to make sure that your contract manufacturer is certified based on the NOM 241. Now the question is, what are the difference between NOM 241 and ISO 13485? Most of the points required in NOM 241 are similar to ISO 13485. It is also required to be in compliance or to follow to have a risk management system based on ISO 14971, and basically all the other main differences are based on local regulatory requirements, like technical information. You will be required, or the manufacturer will be required to present the technical information that was submitted to COFEPRIS, like dossiers, sanitary registrations, and similar type of documents. It is also important to consider the NOM 240. As you remember, we talked about that medical device warehouses must be compliant in NOM 240 and 241. In the case of manufacturers, for technovigilance, it's the same thing. The NOM 240 is also based on the surveillance program that is used for Europe. So if you already have a surveillance program or system based on European directives or guidance, you are basically in compliance with NOM 240. It's worth mentioning that there is no certification for NOM 240. It is for NOM 241. Just to, probably there might be some confusions here regarding the NOM 241 for manufacturers and for medical device warehouses. For medical devices warehouses, they do not need to be certified in NOM 241. They just have to follow it or use it as a guidance for good documentation practices, since they are not manufacturing anything. For manufacturers, they have to be certified by NOM 241 and be in compliance, as well with the NOM 240, though it is there is no certification, as we said, for technovigilance for the NOM 240.
Thanks, Miguel. Now that we have Mexico covered, let's talk about what elements that manufacturers can use from the Mexican and European registration and product submissions. Now, in Europe, there's CE marking, which is required to place medical devices on the market in Europe. A manufacturer can receive CE marking for their products by following the conformity assessments that are required for CE marking, delineated in the medical devices directives for their products. While there are three main directives for medical devices, NIVDs and active implantable medical devices, the conformity assessments that you see on this screen are taken only from the medical devices directive. But in terms of the quality system requirements, they're fairly similar. And if you are familiar with the MDD, you know that there are many more annexes that are included in terms of the conformity assessments. But these three annexes specifically speak to quality system requirements. So, for example, Annex 3 for the type examination doesn't really have quality system requirements, and that's why a lot of times Annex 3 and Annex 5 are combined, for example, because Annex 5 is where you have the quality system requirements. Now, speaking of ISO 13485 and the directive, let's talk about Harmonized Standards. Harmonized Standards are standards that are used to bring a presumption of conformity to the regulatory requirements of the European Medical Devices Directives. Now, the Harmonized Standards are voluntary, although because they provide a presumption of conformity to the state of the art, many manufacturers decide to use them. The Harmonized Standard for Medical Device Manufacturers' Quality Management System is EN ISO 1345. Now, the difference between EN ISO 1345 and ISO 1345 is really just the EN part, and the EN prefix shows that it's accepted by CEN, which is the European Standardization Organization. And if you've seen the EN standards, there's usually also a prefix with the specific national standardization organization, and those standards are still the same as ISO 1345. And that just wraps about our webinar on making markets multitask, the Mexico Medical Device Market Access and ISO 1345 certification for the rest of the world. Thanks so much for staying tuned, and I hope that you found the webinar informational. Now, like I said, both Miguel and I will be sticking around after the webinar answering questions for about 10 minutes or so. And so if you do have questions, absolutely put them in your chat box and we'll answer them as they come in. We'll be sending out the slides in about a week, and we'll post the webinar to our website soon as it's ready. Now, I see that you've been typing out questions throughout the entire webinar, and so, we've been answering as they come in, but if there isn't any that we didn't get to either, in the webinar or afterwards, what we're going to do is consolidate them and send out the answers to you. Like I said, if you can't wait that long, please don't hesitate to give us a call or send us an email. As many of you already know, like I mentioned, we're pretty nice. We actually answer the phone and our email, and we're always happy to talk with you. Now, to start out the questions, Miguel, I do have a couple questions for you, if I may. First, just talking about COFEPRIS, just in terms of, just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing, I have a quick question. So COFEPRIS is the Mexican Ministry of Health. So then, would it be a competent authority?
So Sarah, regarding your question, COFEPRIS is part of the Mexican Ministry of Health. I know I mentioned that we can consider it the Ministry of Health, but technically speaking or legally speaking, COFEPRIS is part of the Ministry of Health. COFEPRIS was created, just as a reference, was created in 2001. Before that time, the Minister of Health was the entity who was reviewing all the documents and releasing the sanitary registrations. Due to the amount of work and all the responsibilities, the authority concluded that it was important to create a separate entity with the name nowadays of COFEPRIS. They are not like a competent authority as it is known in Europe. A competent authority will basically accept the documents from the notified body. In the case of COFEPRIS, they will review all the technical information and release the sanitary registrations as well. There are a slight difference, and we will prefer just to not use it as a comparison.
Okay, great. So can I jump in with another question? So you're talking about third-party reviewers before. Are the third-party reviewers the same as the notified bodies or a certification body, or are they different?
Regarding the third-party reviewers, it's like with COFEPRIS and the competent authority. Third-party reviewers are not exactly the same as notified bodies. Since the third party will release a pre-approval for all the documents they have been reviewed, they will not release like a final statement that will be accepted by the competent authority. It is different. So again, we will prefer not to use like to consider third party and notified bodies as synonyms. There are different things somehow.
Okay, great, thanks. So I have another quick question, if I may. What if a manufacturer's device is marketed in Canada but not the US, and the manufacturer is based in the US? So they're based here in the United States, but they don't have FDA. But they do have, they're not approved by the FDA, but they do sell in Canada. Can the manufacturer still take advantage of the equivalency route?
So if a manufacturer's device is marketed in Canada but not the US, but the manufacturer is based in the US, they are eligible for the equivalency route. And the main reason is because in COFEPRIS, you will choose the regulatory route, equivalency route, using documents from Health Canada, only documents from Health Canada, not from the FDA. So yes, you're eligible, and this is a good strategy for this type of manufacturers.
Okay, that makes sense. So I have another question. Now you mentioned that the manufacturer should have a good manufacturing practices certificate. Would this be the same as the ISO 1345 certificate? Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion of that. Or are the GMPs not the same as a quality management system? And if they are, is it fair to say that if the manufacturer has an ISO 1345 certificate, that could be their proof of good manufacturing practices for COFEPRIS? And finally, I know there's a lot of questions all wrapped up into one, do the submissions that they have to submit to COFEPRIS, do they have to be in Spanish?
So about good manufacturing practice certificate for the documents that are required by COFEPRIS, yes, it is the same as ISO 13485 certificate, but also it's important to mention that good manufacturing practices certificates that are also released by competent authorities in the country of origin of the product are also accepted. A good example is Anvisa in Brazil. They have their local good manufacturing practice certificate, which are also accepted in Mexico. And well, ISO 13485 certificate is a very well-known document in Mexico. If you have, for my advice is if you have ISO 13485 and good manufacturing practices certificate from your authority in the country of origin, I will suggest to present ISO 13485. This is a very well-known document in Mexico. About your question that all information must be in Spanish, yes, this applies for technical documents and for legal documents as well. For legal documents, this must be translated in Spanish by an expert translator, and the legal document must be apostille or consularized in the country of origin. So Sarah, I have a quick question. What about ISO 9001?
So thank you, Miguel. So ISO 9001 is really a precursor to ISO 1345. ISO 1345 came after ISO 9001, ISO 9001 being sort of the base quality management system standard for manufacturing generally. But ISO 1345 has specific requirements for medical device manufacturers. So as a result, it's the standard that many medical device regulators want to see manufacturers follow.
So ISO 13485 is required in Canada and Europe to receive the medical device authorization. Is it the same in other countries?
So if I could just clarify just a little bit from your question, the Canadian version of ISO 1345-2003 is required in Canada, but like I mentioned, the EU regulations don't require ISO 1345. The European version of ISO 1345 is a harmonized standard, which is voluntary, like I mentioned. But some other countries do require ISO 1345. Like off the top of my head, I know a couple of the Asian countries do. So they don't have to comply with all of the annexes in terms of the directive, but they may have to comply with two. So like I mentioned, sometimes the Annex 5 is coupled with Annex 3, and sometimes it's coupled with Annex 7. So depending on the class of the device, the directive states which conformity assessment routes are open to the manufacturer to use. In some cases, for example, like I mentioned, if the manufacturer is using a type examination, it may need to comply with both annexes that are listed in the directive.
How difficult is it to comply with the annexes if a manufacturer is ISO 13485 certified?
So the difficulty of complying with the annexes when you already have ISO 1345 really depends on a bunch of different factors. So the annexes themselves have more requirements than just the quality management system. It also includes requirements for your technical documentation, and you also have the rest of the directive, not just the annexes, but the rest of the directive to comply with as well. So it really depends on how up to speed the manufacturer is on those other requirements. For example, their technical documentation. Even if they have ISO 1345, if they don't have technical documentation, they can't get CE marking. And I think that's all the questions that Miguel and I have for each other. So, like I mentioned, Miguel and I are going to stick around for the next 10 minutes or so to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks so much.